All right, so this is the review for the part two, the second practical, the final practical, and it starts with the joints, the articulations. And again, this is going to be on the practical, but it's not a big part of it. So we start with just understanding that there are three types of joints. The first type is called a fibrous joint. These three types are classified by what is between the two bones. Now there's another type of classification about whether it's movable, and that is synarthritic, amphiarthritic, diarthritic. Synarthritic joints are not movable. Amphiarthritic joints are somewhat movable, and diarthritic joints are freely movable. Now that's not one that I really too worried about, but you do need to know that in the grand scheme of things. Now, this categorization of joints now into the type of tissue that connects them. The first one is a fibrous joint. We have three fibrous joints. Now, of these three, the most important one for us is that I want you to know is this suture. Now, I do want you to know a little bit about the other ones, but the suture is the one that is the key. So a syndesmosis joint is basically a joint that is, there's no joint cavity. You'll see the joint cavities are the hallmark of the synovial joints, the last ones and the main ones we look at. So there are a few areas where we're going to have like a ligament like this in here that's holding two bones together, but there's no joint capsule, no joint cavity. And so it's literally just something tying two bones together. This is a syndesmosis type of a joint. Again, not too worried about. Suture is the one that I do expect you to know. You actually should know it right now before even the review, because we looked at sutures in the skull. We had the areas where the cranial bones came together, and we looked at the four common types of sutures. We talked about the coronal, we talked about the sagittal. Those are named for the planes. The one that's in the back between the occiput and the two parietal bones we said was the lambdoidal, and the one that is between the temporal bone and the parietal bone is called the squamous. But I want you to know that they're a type of suture, all right, which is a type of a fibrous joint. And then lastly, the third is called a gomphosis joint. If you are going into dental hygiene, this is one that you will definitely need to know. The gomphosis joint is this joint between the tooth and the bone that it is sitting in. So we know that the ligament that holds it in is called the periodontal ligament. Again, if you want to, I'm not going to test you on that, but hopefully that just makes sense. I mean, periodontal, most people know periodontist means, has something in reference to the dentist and teeth. But a gomphosis joint is the joint of the tooth. And you can kind of remember that if you lose this joint, you have to gum your food. And that's my little way of a joke. But of these three, by far, the one that you do need to know is the suture. The next type of joint is a cartilaginous joint. There's only two types of cartilaginous joints. One type, the synchondrosis, is going to be hyaline cartilage. The other type, the symphysis, is going to be fibrocartilage. Now, the synchondrosis joint, the joint I want you to know as a synchondrosis, is the epiphyseal plate. Now, you've had to deal with that in the skeletal system, so hopefully you know that and understand. I mean, the epiphyseal plate is the growth plate, and what we have is we're going to have the epiphysis, we'll have this little plate of cartilage, and then the diaphysis. It's a terrible drawing, but that is what it is, that little epiphyseal plate. As long as that's cartilage there, and again, we know it's hyaline cartilage, that is a synchondrosis type of cartilaginous joint. The other type of cartilaginous joint is a symphysis joint. The symphysis joint is made up of fibrocartilage. Now, we could say, these intervertebral discs, these are areas that would be a symphysis type joint. But the one I will tell you to remember that I think is the easiest is this thing called the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis. It is between the two pubic bones, and it is a symphysis type of joint. So it tells you everything you kind of need to know with that. So a symphysis type joint is fibrocartilage. And the main one that I would expect you to know is the pubic symphysis. Now, from there, we get to the star of the show, the synovial joints. Now, with these, there's not a lot that I expect you to know in here. I'm not going to have this picture, but if I did, I would expect you to know certain things. First, there is a joint capsule. The joint capsule is made up of two layers, a fibrous capsule and the synovial membrane. The fibrous capsule goes from the bone of one to the bone of the other, crosses the joint. The synovial membrane's on the inside. The synovial membrane secretes a fluid called synovial fluid. And that area that it makes is called the joint cavity. All right. Now that's just some real basic idea about this. Again, the articulations is not a big part of this practical, and the part that is coming up. All right. So there are two sections that I want you to know. One starts with this. There are three types of synovial joints classified by shape and movement. And what will happen on the practical is I will have like the picture here and ask you to identify it, or I will tell you what the type of joint is, like it is here, and ask you to identify it. Or if I give you the name ball and socket and ask you what the classic joint would be, I'd expect you to know the classic joint. So the ball and socket joint, which the classic joint is the hip. It is this picture here. Right? It is talking about the ball, the head of the femur, which looks like a ball, and the acetabulum of the coccyx, which is a socket. It's a ball and socket joint. The condylar joint is going to be the joints between the metacarpals and phalanges. This is what we would refer to as knuckles. This first layer of joints here, if you made a fist, they would be your knuckles. That is what we would consider the condylar joints. The plane joints are going to be found between the carpals. If you said wrist, that would be fine, but it is the joint between the carpals. And so this joint is called a plane or gliding joint because these little blocks that are the short bones that we learned of, when they slide back and forth against each other, they slide in distinct planes, and the sliding motion is referred to as gliding. So that's where the two names for that joint comes from. The next type of joint is going back to kind of like the ball and socket. This is the hinge joint, and this is a very classic joint. It is the elbow. The elbow is the classic type of hinge joint. The last two, the pivot joint, is atlas axis. This area that we call the dens is the point of rotation, which is another way of saying the pivot point. And so that's where we get the idea of the pivot joint. And lastly is the saddle joint. The saddle joint is between the metacarpal of the thumb and the carpals. This allows for opposable thumbs. Now again, with these six, the main way is going to be I will have this picture and you tell me what is the type of joint that it is, and then move on. The next group is going to be joint movements. And there will be two joint movements, and they will basically be the pictures, like this picture. And what would happen is I would end up having this all marked out, so you can't see it, and I just have like question, and there I'd have like question 2 or whatever. And I would make sure you notice the arrows that they are pointed with. So to start with, look at this picture, this abduction versus adduction. Again, I mispronounced the B and the D to make sure you know what I'm talking about. Abduction versus adduction. Abduction means I'm taking something away. If something is abducted, it is removed. So abduction means I'm moving a body part, like in this instance, the leg, away from midline. If I am adding something together, that means I'm making it one. So adduction or adduction is bringing the leg in. I'm not worried about lateral flexion, flexion extension. Like for this picture, remember flexion is going to be bending the knee on this. Extension is straightening out the knee. When we get to the ankle here, we've got dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is when I'm moving the toes up. Plantar flexion is when I'm moving the toes down. Dorsiflexion would be like walking on my heels. Plantar flexion would be like walking on my toes. Now, circumduction and rotation, because I don't like these pictures, wouldn't be on the practical. I'll go ahead and tell you. But circumduction means I'm moving around a point of rotation while never being on it. For this, for instance, so lateral rotation versus medial rotation, which again, a lot of people have heard of it as internal versus external. They are the same. The point of rotation is the humerus right here. So they are moving around the radius or the point of rotation while staying on it. So that's why it's called rotation. Now, again, don't worry about those two. I hope you understand them, but I'm not going to ask you about them. Supination and pronation is something that is fair game. I like the picture of it. Supination is palms up. Pronation is palms down. Supination, the palm is considered the face of the hand. So if I have palms up, that means the face is up. Supine means laying face up. So supination means the palm is face up. Pronation refers to this being prone. If I'm laying face down, it's prone. So pronation is talking about the hand. Going back to the ankle, I can take the foot and move the bottom, the sole inward. This is called inversion. If I try to move the sole out, that is eversion. You will find that eversion is much harder than inversion. If you are going into physical therapy, you will deal mainly with inversion ankle sprains. The few eversion ankle sprains you will deal with will also have a broken distal fibula because it would have to break in order for it to get to the point of causing a problem. And then the last two movements, protraction, sticking something forward, retraction is pulling it back in, versus elevation, raising my shoulders, depression, pushing them down. So that would be on it. So as far as articulations go, the two main things to really make sure you know, the 6 joint types and these different types of joint movements. Those would be the bulk of the questions from this. I'm not going to ask anything, and I kept these slides on here just to let you know as I'm going through. I'm not asking anything on these on the practical. The hips and the knee and the elbow are not going to be part of the practical. So from there, we end up getting into the muscles. So again, in the areas, if you are in my in-person class, I will have a picture of the, the picture, which I'll show you in just a minute, and there will also be a model labeled. If you're in my online class, it'll just be the picture. Now, I can't tell you because the online class, I know that a lot of times they have a departmental practical. I try to change as many pictures as I can to make sure I use the ones I go over, but I can't guarantee it because it is a departmental thing. Online, there's a lot more structure as far as making sure everything is departmental. So can't promise you it's this, but it's still the same structure. So this is a muscle fiber, all right, also called a muscle cell. They're one and the same. The muscle fiber, and I'm going to use the highlighter on this, the cell membrane of a muscle fiber is called the sarcolemma. Actually, to go back with the pen, I will tell you, there are things that I will not ask. A mitochondria, I'm not worried about you knowing. Nucleus, I'm hoping you know those. These openings, not going to do it. Nucleus up here, nip. Really not even worried about the cisternate of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We'll talk about that just briefly. So I'm only going to have a few parts. Right? So the very first thing, and actually I'll erase this. So the very first thing is the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is the muscle cell membrane. It is not normal. It is designed to transmit a signal. Now, it is called that because of this. Now, it will have extensions called transverse tubules, which will extend into the cell. These transverse tubules take that electrical current into the cell. Now, the reason being, and I'm going to get into the process but a little bit, but I want you to know that inside the cell, I have these reoccurring specialized organelles called myofibrils. Now, in the myofibrils, there's something in here I want you to know that is not necessarily labeled. That the myofibrils are broken up into areas, individual sections, and these are called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres are the fundamental unit of contraction. So the myofibrils are broken up into sarcomeres. And there's a little machine process that's going to go, and calcium is the key to get the machine moving. Now, these areas, which we said were the transverse tubules, right, which is this little part here extending into the cell, in between them, I'm going to have areas of webbing called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum holds on to calcium. As the transverse tubules become electrified, because the sarcolemma is electrified, the sarcoplasmic reticulum will release its calcium, which will cause the muscles to start to contract. Now, on either side of the transverse tubule is an enlargement of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which again up here is going to say that it is the cistern of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. All I want you to know outside of the transverse tubule, anything about these three, I want you to know that they're called the triad. So I have the sarcolemma, which is simply the cell membrane, is extensions, the sarcolemma's extensions into the cell called transverse tubules. In between the transverse tubules is this webbing called sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the transverse tubules and the sarcoplasmic reticulum wrap around these structures called myofibrils, and the myofibrils are made up of sarcomeres. Now again, I hope that makes sense. This usually is a pretty straightforward station or question bank on this part. From there, I'm going to skip the zones and lines and whatever. From there, we start naming muscles. Now, in this, I am going to use, as I'm going over this, these pictures. There might be a time I use the model to show you, but I'm really using these pictures. So on the practical, if it's in person, I'm going to try to use these pictures along with the models. But the picture, so one is there for the other, so you can kind of see it. Online, it's all pictures. So again, I will try to use these. So we have certain muscles in here. Now, before we get to it, because I'm going to need to change the screen in a minute, so I'm going to save this first section that I went over in person till the second part. We have a group of muscles called the time muscles. They are the muscles of mastication. Now, we'll see I need a different picture to go over those, but I can see the T and the M on these. So I will make sure I make a note of it. The I and the E can only be seen on the following picture. So the muscles of mastication are the temporalis, I didn't mean to mark through that, and the masseter. All right, so this one right here and this one right in here. All right, now the other two, the internal and external pterygoids, which can also be called medial and lateral, we'll talk about on the next picture. But those two I'm thinking are pretty easy to see. The temporalis is obviously named because it is covering the temporal bone. So we have two other muscles up here that are named for the bone that they're covering, the frontalis over the frontal bone and the occipitalis over the occiput. Now from there we look at two sets of round muscles. Each eye has a round muscle called the orbicularis oculi around it. The little cavity that the eye sits in is called the ocular socket. And so the round muscle around the eye is called the orbicularis oculi. It's sometimes called the winking muscle because it's going to cause your eye to wink. Now, the other area where we have a round muscle is around the mouth. The mouth is the oral cavity, so it is called the orbicularis oris. Again, can be called the kissing muscle, but this is the name of it, the orbicularis oris. So I've got the muscle around here, around the eye, and then a muscle around the mouth. All right. Now, everybody remembers the fun of our buddy, the zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic arch is going to be right here. Now, the zygomatic arch has two muscles that come off of it. One is pretty straightforward, the masseter. It's a big one. The other one is the zygomaticus. It's got the name for it. Now, the zygomaticus has two parts. The part that I would expect you to know comes straight off the zygomaticus and goes straight to the corner of the orbicularis oris. It'll cause you to kind of snarl a little bit. Now, deep to these, I have a muscle called the buccinator. Now, the buccinator is the cheek muscle, and I used in lecture or in lab in person, I used the picture of our buddy Dizzy Gillespie, the horn player. If you haven't heard of that, Dizzy Gillespie, a famous jazz trumpetist. If you see some of his pictures, you'll see his cheeks puffed way out. That was his trademark. So I always mispronounce this, which may be not the best thing to teach people, but I mispronounce this as the bugulator. And I could remember it's the buccinator, the bugle. And so I'd say when Dizzy Gillespie blew his bugle, his buccinator would puff out. Now, the last two are more in the cervical area that we see on this picture. I have one called the platysma. The platysma is only going to be seen on pictures. On any model, it's going to be taken off because it covers so much structure, because it's going to attach to the corners here, and maybe I'll use a different color. I'll use blue. It's going to attach to the corners here of the orbicularis oris and go all the way down. So it's all this, in the front and over on the other side. The anterior portion of the cervical spine is covered by this really broad, thin muscle, and I'll erase that there, called the platysma. And the last one that we can see on this model, on this particular one, I didn't mean it to be blue, but I'll just keep it as that, the sternocleidomastoid. Now, I will tell you that this one I hear students get all kinds of crazy about because of how the name is. But remember, it's well named, actually. So I'm going to divide a line here. The mastoid, the sternum, and the clavicle make up these three parts. And this is a good section, a good muscle that I want to use to kind of show you about origin and insertion. So this is the muscle right here. And I'll get back to my little part here. It goes all the way down, this big muscle right along your neck. Now, if I am looking at it, I've got the mastoid here, which is this part. And then you don't see it down here, but as it comes down, it's going to attach to the sternum, the manubrium particularly, and the clavicle. So it's going to have these little parts here. And so I'm going to put this as B. So B represents the sternocleido part. Ooh, didn't mean to do that. But anyway, if I'm looking at origin and insertion, remember, origin is the fixated end, insertion is the movable end. So when I contract this muscle, does A get pulled down to B? Does my ear get pulled down to my chest, or does my chest get pulled up to my ear? If you sit there and do this, you will see that your ear bends down to your chest. So A, which is the mastoid, is the insertion. The sternum and clavicle are the origin. And again, if you're looking at it, just contract that muscle. You'll see that your chest doesn't come up to your ear goes down to your chest. To use another example, since I want to make sure we're good, because there will be a question or two about origin insertion of certain muscles, and they will be straightforward. So if I have the masseter here, so the masseter is this one right here, so we're right on this muscle right here, and I say I've got A, the zygomatic arch, and B, the lower border of the mandible. When this muscle contracts, does A get pulled down to B, or does B get pulled up to A? And all you have to do is clench your jaw muscle, and you'll see that B gets pulled up to A. B is the insertion, A is the origin. All right. So, just a quick review of this. That doesn't do it. So, just a quick review of this. We're going to say the muscles here. Try to erase most of my chicken scratch, as I would have said it before. So we have frontalis, occipitalis, and temporalis. Three muscles that are named for the bones of the cranial bones. The temporalis is going to be in a group with another muscle called the masseter, the main muscle at this angle of the jaw. If you see someone clenching your teeth, that muscle is flaring out. I've got two round muscles, or groups of round muscles. I've got two orbicularis oculi, one around each eye, and then one orbicularis oris, one around my mouth. I'm going to have another muscle along with the masseter that comes off the zygomatic arch, but this one is much smaller. It's called the zygomaticus. Then finally, I have a muscle that is basically my cheek. It's called the buccinator. Again, and the bugle. But anyway, then we get the sternocleidomastoid, this big muscle here with a long name but well named, and then finally the platysma. Now, going back to what I originally said, there were a group of muscles called the time muscles. In the time muscles, I am going to have two muscles that I can't see on this picture, which is the one we just looked at. Now, the time muscles, again, I call them the time muscles. The muscles of mastication are T, I, M, and E. And again, sorry, trying to draw with the mouse. The T and the M are pretty straightforward. Temporalis, masseter. Now, the I and the E represent internal and external pterygoids. Now, on our model here, they are named lateral and medial, and that freaks people out. Now, internal and external are an easy way to remember it, to remember this acronym. The muscles of mastication are called the time muscles. If I am labeling it, this idea of medial and lateral helps out as well, because the medial pterygoid runs in this direction, which mirrors the masseter. So I've got two with the M, right? M and M, and they both run in basically the same direction. So I can remember the medial masseter is just deep to the masseter. Now, to tell which is which, one easy way is the medial, the word medial is the only part of this that has an I. Lateral does not have an I in it. So the medial and the internal are the same ones. If I wanted to say, all right, I want to look at the lateral, sorry, the lateral. So I'm going to go back up here and draw this E as the time muscles. I can easily make that E into an L by erasing two little spots. So lateral, the L and the E have very similar breakups of how to write it. So lateral and external are the same, medial and internal are the same. And again, both ways of naming it have good purposes. All right, so moving on. Now we look at the thorax, the chest. And so in this, we start with, first, let me tell you, there's some muscles that I am not going to ask you on this. Right? So right away, this is not where I would ask you to identify the trapezius. This is not where I would ask you to identify the sternocleidomastoid. I would hope you'd still be able to do it, but this isn't where I'm going to ask it. So on this, I really probably won't even ask the deltoid on this type of picture. The deltoid's a shoulder muscle, but you can see it, but probably not on this. So the ones that I would look at, first, this area right here is called the pectoralis area. And so the largest muscle here is called the pectoralis major. The pectoralis major is a pretty obvious one. We commonly call it pecs. I will not take that. It is the pectoralis major. If I was to remove that, deep to the pectoralis major is another muscle, and it's a little smaller, so it is called the pectoralis minor. Now, as we go through, there are little muscles that are in between the ribs. The space between the ribs are called intercostal muscles. There's two layers. One is external and one is internal. So they are simply labeled the internal intercostal versus the external intercostal. If I was to label these, I would make sure on the model that the little plate, and I'll show it to you in just a minute, but the little thorax plate, I would label it on the inside for the internal intercostal, as well as when we get to the transverse abdominis, you'll see I would label that on the inside as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. Another set of muscles kind of in this area, and you can see it on either side of this. I've got these little muscles that look like teeth that are coming forward. The word serratus means teeth-like. Serratus anterior are these. They're little muscles that are found in this area, in the axillary area. They almost look like muscular ribs, but they're called the serratus anterior because they are basically like little teeth that point forward. From there, we get to the area of our abdominal area, and there are four muscles here. One works on his own, the other three work together off to the side. The one that works on its own is called the rectus abdominis. The term rectus means midline. So this literally says it is midline in the abdominal region. This is what we commonly refer to as the six-pack, your abs, right? Rectus abdominis. Now, on either side of that, the lateral walls have three muscles that make the abdominal cavity up. And I'm going to show you on a different picture in just a second. The most external is called the external oblique. It is called that because it runs at an angle. Anything that runs at an angle generally is called an oblique. And since it's the most external, it is called the external oblique. If I was able to dissect this out, just underneath it, you would see another muscle that runs at an angle, actually completely opposite, 90-degree angle, called the internal oblique, because it is deep to this. This one is external, this is internal. The most internal is this one called the transverse abdominis. Now I'm going to show you the picture that I would use for that as well, because I don't like the way they did this. Now, this is our little plate model. If I take it and flip it over, I could label two muscles on here. This, the most internal, this is the transverse abdominis. And I know it's hard to see, but if you can tell, the fibers, the muscle fibers run straight across on the transverse plane. The other muscle would be something in between these ribs, and it would be the internal intercostal muscle. All right. Now, here's how I would basically label these three on the lateral abdominal area on a picture. I try to. And the hardest thing for people to understand is this internal oblique is not called internal because it's the most internal of the three. It's just simply the most internal of the two oblique muscles. So the one on the very outside is called the external oblique. That is this one here. If I removed it, the one just underneath it is also running at an angle, so it is called the internal oblique. And if I remove both of those, the most internal is one that's going to run straight across or whatever on the transverse plane called the transverse abdominis. All right? So that's the layers. And again, if I label the transverse abdominis on a picture, it will be on the inside of that plate model if you are taking this as an in-person class. Now, and I'm not going to use this picture, I'll use the drawing. This is our little person. And again, I'm just going to highlight two muscles real quick. I've got a muscle here. Shows up better. I got a muscle here called the trapezius. It looks like this little kite, right? Ooh, that's terrible drawing. Anyway, this right here is the trapezius, right? I'm going to look at it on the picture in just a minute. Then underneath the trapezius, on part of it, if I erase this, I've got another really big muscle on the back, and it is referred to as the latissimus dorsi, which means that it runs from the back to the side, latissimus dorsi. So all this in here. Now let me pull up the picture that I would use. This is our picture. So right away we have the trapezius. And most people think of the trapezius as just this little area here, but they don't realize that it is a very big muscle. So this whole thing down through here. Now, the latissimus dorsi is an even bigger muscle. The latissimus dorsi is going to start, and it's going to run all along the spine and then along the ilium and then all the way up to the humerus. So when we looked at the bone, the humerus, and we talked about that surgical neck, the reason that you can't take out the head of the humerus with everything is one of the many reasons is it's the upper part, the proximal epiphysis of the humerus is a huge muscle attachment point, and one of the big muscles is the latissimus dorsi. Now on this you'll see the shoulder muscle called the deltoid, and on this side over here, these three, that's where I would basically ask questions about them. Now over here I have on this side, I have 4 of the 5 muscles that are associated with the scapula. Now, the scapula, These 5 muscles that are associated with the scapula, 4 of them work together as a group. The one that does not work with others is this one called the teres major. And you can kind of remember that the teres major, if you work with a group and a guy that does or someone doesn't work well with the group, they're considered a major pain. And you will be able to tell this muscle right here does not play well with everything else. Um, it is off on its own, and on the models, it's even easier to see that it is a muscle that is playing by itself. Now, on this posterior side, the back side of this, I have 3 muscles, and you can kind of remember them as sit. All together, the muscles that are called the rotator cuff are referred to as the sits muscles, S-I-T-S. And these first 3 are on the posterior side here. And they are the supraspinatus, right? The supraspinatus is above the spine. Then I have the infraspinatus, which is below the spine, and it's kind of an odd one because if I draw it out here, there's a line right here. Maybe I'll use black here so you can see it. This line right there, this whole area, that is the infraspinatus, all the way here. Now, it has a little buddy that basically leaves its big brother and joins the infraspinatus, and it is called the teres minor. And you can see it right here. I'll just kind of highlight it coming out right here. It kind of peeks out from this little hole. It ends up joining the infraspinatus as its insertion point, but you can really tell that the teres major is off on its own. So the first 3 of the rotator cuff in this sits muscle group is supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. This teres major does not play with the group. If I'm looking at this picture, the only thing I want to point out to this is you can see right here, this is the teres major. And you can see that all the other ones, and we'll look at another picture where the deltoid has been removed, but all these other ones are kind of all grouped together. But this one is off on its own, the teres major. This picture kind of shows some of them. You can see the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, teres minor as a group, teres major off on its own. On this picture, it's pointing out the deltoid, the shoulder muscle that's covering everything, and this muscle on the posterior side of the brachial region, the upper arm, called the tricep brachii. Now, this is if I look at things from the anterior side. So with this, if you can imagine that the ribs have been taken out, and so I'm looking at the underside of the scapula. And so the muscle all in through here on this underside of the scapula is called the subscapularis, literally meaning under the scapula. And that is the last S in the SITS acronym of the rotator cuff. So the rotator cuff is the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and the subscapularis. This is our picture. So we see basically what's been removed is all through here would be the rib cage, right? So the thorax has been removed, so I can see the anterior part of the scapula and the subscapularis. We can see the deltoid here, and now we're looking at the anterior muscle called the bicep brachii. Now the brachialis is one we didn't go over. I'm not going to ask you about the clavicle here, and I wouldn't use this to ask the trapezius. Again, this is our picture of the model. You can easily see on this the teres major not wanting to take part with the group. On this part would be the supraspinatus. This, if I draw a little line here, right here, all of this is the infraspinatus. This is the teres minor. Now, once we get into the area where the elbow is and below, it's hard to see on these pictures. Right? So there are 6 muscles that you need to see. So right now I'm going to start with just looking at the posterior side. So this is the posterior view of the hand. On this, I have a group of muscles that works together. It's actually a couple different muscles, but they work together to move or extend the fingers. It is called the extensor digitorum is the name of it. And again, they are designed to extend the fingers. It's the only thing you see on that you're naming on the posterior side in this lower part of the arm, so that should help you narrow it down. If I look on the anterior part, and again, it's hard to see on this model, I have one muscle, the largest muscle, and it doesn't even show up well. Let's see, right over here, right? So this, on this picture, before we go any further, on this picture, this is medial and this is lateral. Remember, on the medial, I have the ulna, and on the lateral, I have the radius, all right? Now, on this lateral side, I have a muscle that starts a little bit above the elbow and runs all the way down the radius. This is called the brachioradialis. It's the only muscle on this lateral side that we look at. The brachioradialis starts in the brachial region, runs along the radius. Now, the harder part is I have a group of four muscles that originate on the medial side, and they end up fanning out like the rays of the sun. Maybe I'll use yellow for this. Maybe it'll show up. So and that doesn't show up. Okay. I'll use blue. So they go out, out and down, out in the middle, and out and down. So they start in a little point and they go out kind of like rays of the sun. All right. Now I'm going to use the picture coming up here in a second to show it. I think the drawing might be a little easier, even though it has its challenges. But these are named really well. So again, this side, and I'll just use this now. So this is lateral. This is medial. Lateral is the radius. That's terrible. The medial is the ulna. All right. So I have only one muscle on this side that originates and stays on this side called the brachioradialis. That is it right here. If you make a fist, have it to where it's basically like your thumb is up, like you're giving a thumbs up, and then try to take your wrist and move it around and feel at your elbow on this lateral side, and you'll feel this muscle contract. Now, besides that, there are four muscles that originate here. They end up, one cuts across straight to the radius. Another one cuts across, runs along the radius, and attaches at the carpals. The next one stays medial and attaches into the palm. The last one starts medial and stays medial, runs along the ulna, and attaches to the carpals. So I'm going to erase all of this gobbledygook, and then I will go over them point by point. So the one that, let's see, maybe I'll use the one that starts here and goes across over to this is called the pronator teres. Right? The pronator teres. And the reason it's called that is that when this muscle contracts, right, it is going to take and it's going to pull the radius over this way, causing pronation. So it is called pronator teres. Now, outside of that, now I'll erase this. And I'll keep pronator teres highlighted, and I'll use this as it's going down here. Now, the next one, and actually the next three, all end up coming down to the hand. The next one cuts across, runs down the radius, attaches to the carpals. When this muscle contracts, insertion, origin, it is going to pull my hand in, causing flexion. So it is going to cause flexion. It attaches to the carpals, and runs along the radius. So it is called flexor carpi radialis. The very next one runs right in the middle and it goes into the palm. Now you can kind of see that it doesn't, like I want to make a point to show that this particular one doesn't go underneath this little tunnel of tissue. It pokes out. It is going to attach in the palm. This one is referred to as the palmaris longus. The last one, it is going to start medial and stay medial. It runs along the ulna, it comes down here, it attaches to the carpals, and it causes flexion. Its name is flexor carpi ulnaris. Again, it is going to cause flexion by running along the ulna and attaching to the carpals. So hopefully these make sense. Again, there's 4 that come out of this little medial aspect of my elbow. Only one that's over here on the lateral aspect, and it is, excuse me, a big one called the brachioradialis. All right, so now we get into the leg. With the leg, I'm going to use this picture right here. So this area of the leg is called the gluteal region, and we refer to this large one back here as the gluteus maximus. And as I jokingly say, I will not take booty as an answer. All right, the gluteus maximus. Then I have this gluteal muscle that is pretty much straight up and down, the 12 o'clock hour. It is called the gluteus medius. And then finally, I have this one on the anterior side, and everybody wishes it had a gluteal name, but it is called the tensor fascia lata. And it has a good name because it, as it says, tenses a lot of fascia. This whole tendon right here is something called the iliotibial band. You might have heard the iliotibial band syndrome or ITB syndrome. The IT band syndrome, that's what it is. So the tensor fascia lata. So I have the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, and the tensor fascia lata up here in this area. Those were the only 3 that I would want you to see on this type of picture. Now, when we get into the femoral area or thigh, we have groups of muscles. So one of the first groups of muscles is this group called the quadriceps. Now, I'm going to use a picture in just a second, but you can see 3 of them very clearly on this. The very first one is called the rectus femoris. It is this one right here in the middle. Rectus means midline. This is saying it's midline in the femoral region. Then we have this part that's on the lateral side called the vastus lateralis, this part that's on the medial side called the vastus medialis. And what ends up happening here is, if I could, I'm going to use, let's see what color it is, green might show up. There is a big muscle right here called a vast muscle. The rectus femoris gets right in the middle of it and pushes it down. And kind of like if I took a pillow and put a bat in the middle of the pillow and pushed it down, part of the pillow gets pushed lateral. We call that the vastus lateralis. Part of it gets pushed medial, vastus medialis. And then there is this part that's stuck underneath the rectus femoris called the vastus intermedius. Those 3 make up the quadriceps. Again, they are 4 muscles. It really originates as 2. All right. So with this on this type of picture, again, this is the model, so it'll be labeled. But when I'm looking at the picture, this would be what is in it. So with this, I have the vastus medialis. Whoa, that's not supposed to be like that. That was supposed to be a highlighter. So the vastus medialis, the part of the vastus muscle that's medial. Vastus lateralis, part of the vastus muscle that is lateral. The rectus femoris, which is this muscle right here in the middle. Now again, on this picture, you do not see the vastus intermedius. And even on the model, unless I am to remove the part of the model that is the rectus femoris, you cannot see the vastus intermedius. Now on this picture, I will tell you, again, let me see, I think I can highlight in black. How about that? if I highlight in black, I'll say I'm not worried about this. I'm not worried about this. On this, I'm not going to have you label the tensor fascia lata there. And these two adductor muscles, I would only ask, and you'll see in a minute. So on this picture, what I would look for, again, we've got the three muscles you can see of the four muscle group, the quadriceps, the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and rectus femoris. And then I have two muscles that make like this V. The first one is the sartorius. It starts over here on the anterior side and it cuts across the leg to the medial side, the thigh to the medial side, and it attaches down here. The insertion point is down here on the medial aspect of the tibia. This is called the sartorius. It has a counterpart that starts medial and stays medial called the gracilis. If I was able to turn this around this way and look at it, you would see that the sartorius cuts across and the gracilis stays medial, and they attach. That's a terrible picture, but they attach on the medial aspect down here of the knee. All right, so those would be the five I'd expect you to be able to see on this picture. The adductor longus and adductor magnus, I would use this picture to see. So the adductor longus and adductor magnus are both adductor muscles, which means they're going to cause your leg to go midline, or you close your legs. The adductor longus is a very long and very broad muscle, or a very long and very narrow muscle. It starts on the pubic bone and it attaches pretty much right along midway of the femur. Its counterpart, the adductor magnus, which means big, is going to start on the ischium, the posterior part, and it pretty much runs the whole entire medial length of the femur. So it's called magnus. Longus usually means long, skinny. So that's the difference between these two. And this picture, I will ask one of them on the practical, and obviously it'll be from this picture. And then finally, well, this is a good picture on the model to see this, and I'll use blue so it shows up. This is the gracilis, and this is the sartorius, and how they come down and have a common insertion point here. Now, on the posterior side of the leg, you will see a group called the hamstrings. Now, with this, I would not ask gluteus medius. I might potentially ask about the gluteus maximus. That's easy to see. We haven't covered this yet, but it is a good way to see the gastrocnemius. And so that is a potential. I think you can see both those muscles clearly, but this picture really is about this group that's right here. I've got a group called the hamstrings. The hamstrings are in the posterior part of the leg. And so there are three muscles. Two of them work as a group, and they have names that pretty much tell you they work as a group. They start with the first part of the name is semi. The two semis make a whole. I've got the semitendinosus, which is the top of the two muscles, and the semimembranous. Now these two are going to be on the medial side, all right? The lateral side only has one muscle. That muscle is called the bicep femoris. Now the bicep femoris and the bicep brachii are very similar muscles. They both have two heads, and they both cause flexion at the joint that they are the prime mover for. Bicep femoris causes flexion at the knee. Bicep brachii causes flexion at the elbow. So these are the three. Semitendinosus with its partner semimembranous, and then the bicep femoris on the lateral side, all by itself. So finally, we get down to the lower leg, and I will use this picture. Now again, on this picture, I am not going to, that's not what I was going to do. I am not going to ask you these here. I would use the picture we just looked at for that. So on this picture, I'm looking for the gastrocnemius. We commonly call it the calf, but the name of it is the gastrocnemius. And we have a medial lateral head. On the practical, I will probably ask you if I label this, and I probably will, that to be specific. if I put the label here, that didn't show up well, but let's say if I put the label here and I say be specific and you just put gastrocnemius, I'm going to have to count it wrong. It is the medial head of the gastrocnemius. And it would be a shame, basically, because I'm going to have this labeled over here, medial and lateral. Now, underneath the gastrocnemius, I am going to have a muscle that doesn't get the fanfare that the quote unquote calf does. Everybody knows about the calves, but underneath that, I have a muscle that works with it called the soleus. The soleus and the calf, or the gastrocnemius, I should say, have a common tendon called the calcaneal tendon. The calcaneal tendon is going to be what ties both the gastrocnemius and the soleus to this bone called the calcaneus. Now, the calcaneal tendon can also be called the Achilles tendon, which is fine, but that's what's on this. On our models, the portion that is the gastrocnemius can be pulled off, and on that, when you look at the underside of it, it is really clear to see the soleus. The last two muscles are named for the two bones of the lower limb. So again, on this, just to make sure, I hope you know the tibia. I'm not going to ask you about it. I'm not going to ask about the soleus. I'm not going to ask about the gastrocnemius, the patella ligament, or the patella. What I would ask on this, and I would actually use two pictures for this actually. This bone called the tibia, I have a muscle that runs right along the anterior part called the tibialis anterior. If you point your toes up and feel that bone on the front part of your quote unquote shin, that muscle that's going to contract when you point your toes up, or as we just learned, dorsiflex your ankle, you'll feel that muscle contract. Now, in the lower leg, the tibia is the medial bone, the fibula is the lateral. So the fibularis longus is a muscle that runs lateral and right along the fibula. Now, I might see where I could ask you that here, but really it probably would be this picture. And again, the fibularis longus on this picture, and I'll just highlight it, it's going to come down and it's going to curve right around that part that's called the lateral malleolus, the ankle bone right there, which is the lower part of the fibula. But that's where the fibularis longus is. Now again, I'd probably use this picture instead of the other one to name that, and I would probably not use this one for tibialis anterior or gastrocnemius or soleus or tendon as it goes through it. Really, this picture would mainly be to see the fibularis longus. So now we get into the nervous system. So we have the neuron, and again, so I'm going to use this picture on the neuron. I'm going to have a couple of parts. First, I've got this, which is called the cell body. Hopefully everybody knows that. But off of the cell body, I have two types of appendages possible. One type is called a dendrite. Dendrites bring information into the cell body. The other type, and it's not listed here because it's got other things, is the axon. The axon would be this little part here, if I ask what this structure is that takes information away from the cell body. That's the axon. Now, the axon is going to have a couple of interesting things in it here that are going to be the area, and remember, and I'm going to make sure I make a point of this, it is an area, the area that we see where the axon leaves the cell body is called the axon hillock. That is an area. The axon is a structure. This is an area. So the axon hillock is where the axon leaves. Inside the axon hillock are structures called neurofibrils, protein structures found in this area. Now, there are three things. The axon hillock is an area. Now, neurofibrils and the axon are structures. Neurofibrils are protein filaments, and the axon itself I would compare to the dendrites. Now, the last thing is these little guys called Schwann cells. All right. So all along the axon, I have Schwann cells, and the areas where the Schwann cells don't meet, and have the axon exposed, are called nodes of Ranvier. So these little parts right here are the nodes of Ranvier. And finally, the Schwann cell itself is made up of two parts. I've got a part that is almost entirely, let me get this, cell membrane. We call that myelin. This little part here, layer upon layer, wrapped around and around and around and around the axon. That little part there is called myelin. And so it's myelin or the myelin sheath. And then we have this, and it's hard to see on this picture, and I can't enlarge it right now like I usually do in lab, but the little bubble of cytoplasm on the outside of this is called the neural lemma. That basically is one little bubble of cytoplasm around the outside, and that's where the cell lives, right? So I have dendrites and the axon. Where the axon leaves the cell body is an area called the axon hillock. Inside of there are protein filaments called protein fibers. As the axon extends, I'm going to generally have cells called Schwann cells that myelinated. In between the Schwann cells are little gaps called nodes of Ranvier. The last thing is the Schwann cell itself is made up of two parts. Myelin, which is the layer upon layer of cell membrane, and then the bubble of cytoplasm on the outside called the neural lemma. Then we get to the spinal cord. With the spinal cord, the first thing is look to where the gray matter connects to the outside. It's either going to connect or come very close. That is always going to tell you that this is the posterior or dorsal portion of the spinal cord, and this is the anterior or ventral portion. All right, so once we have that out of the way, then we can start looking at the different parts that are in here. So the very first thing, and it should be pretty easy, is I have white matter all along the outside, and then the inside has gray matter. Right, so all in here is gray matter. In the gray matter, I have areas. I have areas called horns. I have an anterior, or I have this one right here. Let's just say this is a posterior or dorsal horn. This right here is the anterior or ventral horn. Then finally on this, I have a canal in the center called the central canal. Now, from this point, I'm going to move to the next slide, and the next slide is talking about the reflex arc. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you a much clearer picture of what we call the dorsal root ganglion. All right. Now, as I said in class, if you were in an in-person class, I made a point of saying this picture will be on the practical. This picture will be on the practical, right? And it's weird that there's some kind of voodoo hex on it that people missed that. But this is going to be on the practical. So just to go over what we looked at, I've got white matter all around the outside here. I have gray matter in the middle. The gray matter has a posterior or dorsal horn and an anterior or ventral horn and a canal in the center. All right, so that's a review of what we just kind of looked over. Now, the last thing, the structure-wise, is this part right here called the dorsal root ganglion. All right. In a mixed nerve, a spinal nerve, when it enters into the vertebral canal, I have motor impulses come in through the back, and sensory impulses come in through the back, and motor impulses come out of the front. So this nerve over here is called a mixed nerve. But when it comes in, it's dedicated. Sensory coming in through the back, motor going out through the front. And these are called nerve roots. Anywhere there's a swelling on a nerve, it is generally called a ganglion. So this dorsal or posterior nerve root, this is the ganglion on it. So it is called the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. Now, with that in our rear view mirror, I want to use this picture to talk about a simple reflex arc. Right? A simple reflex arc. There are 5 components to a simple reflex arc. The first component is called a receptor. That is what this is. The receptor monitors things. It can be different things. In our lab, we learned that we have chemoreceptors monitoring chemical changes, thermoreceptors monitoring temperature changes, mechanoreceptors looking for mechanical changes like pressure or stretch. And then we had photoreceptors, which are monitoring light energy, which are in the eye. So this receptor is going to be monitoring. So let's say that something lands on our skin, one of those little evil vampires that we call mosquitoes, and our receptor notices it. So the receptor is the first part. The second part is the sensory neuron. The receptor feels it, sends a signal on the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to go in, and it's going to synapse, which is a fancy word of saying drop off its information onto an interneuron. Now, the interneuron is the only neuron, or the only portion of this that is a central nervous system portion. Everything else is peripheral nervous system. This interneuron is pretty amazing. It is going to analyze the sensory information coming in and decide if something needs to be done. If something needs to be done, then the fourth step is sending that information out on a motor neuron. That motor neuron is going to go to either a muscle or a gland to make something change, and we call whatever it goes to an effector. So the 5 parts of a simple reflex arc are receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector. And again, the only part of this that is considered a central nervous system portion is the interneuron. All right. So then we look at the brain. Now I'm going to use this model of the brain right here because there's not a lot of good things. You'll see the picture that I will use, but there will be a model. First of all, this part right here, this whole big gray wrinkly part, this is called the cerebrum. This brown part is called the cerebellum, and this little white stalk you barely see here, that is called the brain stem. Now, to erase this, what I want to use in this, because we don't have another picture that does a good job of the cerebrum has 4 lobes that you need to be able to identify. Now, first, wherever the cerebellum is, that means this is posterior. This is anterior, and you can say dorsal or ventral, whatever. Now, this up here is the frontal lobe. This in the back is the occipital lobe. There is a little area that we can kind of see that looks like a little thumb, a little mitten that's right here. This right here is the temporal lobe, and above it is the parietal lobe. So those are the 4 lobes: frontal, occipital, temporal, and parietal. Looking at our picture of the cross section, this right here, this whole area would represent the cerebrum. All right. Now the cerebrum has 2 halves. There are two hemispheres that are called. Now the hemispheres are connected and communicate with each other through this band of tissue right here called the corpus callosum. Now, underneath the corpus callosum, and I'm going to go back to this, and I'll just use yellow here. If I drew a little area here, this is our best representation of an area we refer to as the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon is going to have two areas inside of it. Now, I'm going to draw 2 little spots. I'm going to draw one here and one here. So I'm going to put 1 and 2. Now, if I ask for the general name of the general area, the name of the general area is the diencephalon. But these 2 parts are specific areas. And if I asked you to name them, just the name should let you know. One is called the thalamus, one is called the hypothalamus. And just in naming it, you should know that one is the area of the thalamus. Right? This one is the area of the thalamus, and this is the area of the hypothalamus. Again, because the name is telling you it's below the thalamus. Now, the thing about the hypothalamus is it controls this gland that we call the pituitary gland, the master gland of the body. You will find in 211 that the hypothalamus is the cross section that goes between your nervous system and the endocrine system. Now again, that we're not going to get into that in here, but just pointing it out. So from there, we have the area that we call the cerebellum. We said it is simply this little lobe here. And then we get to the thing we call the brain stem. The brain stem is going to have, right, so if I'm going to circle the brain stem, there's parts. So this part, this green part, is called the midbrain. It's the uppermost area and people get confused by it, but if you just remember, it is basically in the middle of the brain. If I'm measuring all this stuff, it's pretty much right in the middle of it. From there, I have this swelling that we refer to as the pons. So this area here is the pons. And then finally, the bottommost part, this part is called the medulla oblongata. Everybody's favorite word to say. And if you ever are having a bad day, say medulla oblongata, and you should smile or laugh. So those are the parts on this picture. Again, I've got chicken scratch all over it. If I try to erase it again, hopefully you'll see the parts to it. Again, if I go through cerebrum, cerebellum, corpus callosum, underneath that is the area called the diencephalon. In the diencephalon, two specific areas, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to control this called the pituitary gland. Finally, we have this entire structure called the brainstem with its three parts. The midbrain, which is the upper part of the brainstem, the pons, which is the area that looks like it's kind of pregnant, and then the very bottommost part, the medulla oblongata. All right. Now, from here, we have some ideas of cranial nerves. Now, I'm going to skip ahead because this is what I want you to know with the cranial nerves. First of all, because we have the optic nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerves on our models, you need to know optic nerve is cranial nerve 2 and it's sensory only. The vestibulocochlear isn't on this particular one. It's on the next slide, and I'm going to highlight it as well. Cranial nerve 8, and it is sensory only. I do think that it would be good for you to know the olfactory nerve is sensory only. That is, outside of 2 and 8, right, that is one of the more important ones to know. I would think, clinically speaking, trigeminal and facial kind of tie together. I would know a little bit about them, but I will tell you, you're not going to see anything on the practical with that. So if I go to the next group, obviously, vestibulocochlear nerve, sensory only. It used to be called auditory or acoustic. So if you find a mnemonic that uses that, you can't use the acoustic or auditory, but just remember it's called vestibulocochlear. And on this is the other one that I think that you really, really, really need to know something about. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. The vagus nerve is, in all reality, your parasympathetic nervous system of controlling everything under normal conditions below your chin. All right. By the way, it is the cause of most heart attacks. The most common place to have a heart attack is going number 2, going to the bathroom number 2. That's why there's an emergency call button next to every commode in every hospital and nursing home. And it is all related to the vagus nerve. Right? So definitely know cranial nerve 2 and cranial nerve 8 because they're going to be on our models. They are fair game. Optic and vestibulocochlear, both sensory. I would highly recommend knowing cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. When you get into 211 and you're studying, from that point, all of the systems will talk about the difference in control between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And if you remember parasympathetic, it's going to be vagus. It'll help you. I do think olfactory is an important one to remember, your sense of smell, and then the trigeminal and facial, which I'm not going to ask you about, but I'm telling you, as far as the real world in clinics and stuff, trigeminal neuralgia and trigeminal headaches and the facial nerve and its uh, its manifestation, which is Bell's palsy. If you know anything about Bell's palsy, it's cranial nerve 7. So those would be the ones that I would highlight. But this is not a cranial nerve test. Now, this is going to get into our receptors. Now, in a way, I kind of wish that this was back in that slide with the reflex arc, which again, by the way, is going to be on the practical. But when we're talking about these receptors, there are 5 types. Now, I will tell you that I will use this as something a little bit different. But the 4 types that I'm going to kind of concentrate on: chemoreceptors, chemical changes; thermoreceptors, temperature changes; mechanoreceptors, tension and stretch and pressure; and photoreceptors are light. Again, we're going to have 2 models. One model is going to be the ear. It uses mechanoreceptors. The other model is the eye. It uses photoreceptors. And you definitely need to know that. But nociceptors is the way I want you to know them. Nociceptors are pain fibers. Pain fibers are modified chemoreceptors. Whenever tissue is damaged, it releases a special type of chemical, and these receptors are designed to notice it and send a signal that is pain. What I do want you to remember is pain is not the problem. Pain is a symptom of a problem. If I take, if I have constant headaches and keep taking Tylenol, I'm not finding the root cause. It would be the equivalent of saying that if I have a check engine light that comes on and I spray paint over it, I fix my engine. Right? We are developing these issues where we start these thought processes where we think pain, as long as I can get rid of pain, I got rid of the problem. Pain is a symptom. To find the underlying cause, you need to figure it out. I'm very concerned. A lot of people are doing damage themselves with constant take of, say, something like you're suffering from heartburn, and so you start taking these even if it's prescription things to kind of help keep down the stomach acid, whatever. Look, there's a reason that it's doing it. So, again, make sure that if you are suffering from something that's chronic, don't, don't just mask the symptoms, figure out the problem. Because again, everybody that's been to the dentist and had your mouth numbed and started chewing on your tongue or your cheek found out that, pain's trying to tell you, hey, something's going on. And if it's not there, you can cause lots of problems, but that's for another time. So chemoreceptor, thermoreceptor, mechanoreceptor, photoreceptor. Of those 4, mechanoreceptors are in the ear, photoreceptors are in the eye. A little bit about these receptors in your senses. Remember, and it's pretty common knowledge now, I've seen commercials that call going nose blind. You can adapt to your surroundings. The easiest one to see is our sense of smell. We can easily adapt to our sense of smell. Your house has a smell that you're not familiar with, and you won't notice it until you leave for a while and come back. It's the same reason people put on too much cologne, because they spray it on and they don't realize that it's still there. They adapt to it, so they put some more on to try, and they think it's gone. So you just keep spraying it, and it makes it worse. The same goes for people who need to wear cologne. If you have body odor, you're not really going to smell it because you're around it. All right, so that's sensory adaptation. But with that, let's look at our last 2 structures, the ear and the eye. So this is our model of the ear. The model of the ear is pretty straightforward. Again, most people get this, do well on this part. There'll be one station basically on the ear. I will try to use this picture. All right, so we start with first, and on this, in lab, I try to go over what it's doing, and here I'm going to limit that. But the first thing is the outer part of the ear is called the auricle. I do want you to remember that the auricle is made up of elastic connective or elastic cartilage, like we learned at the beginning. It is going to funnel sound waves into a canal here. This is called the external acoustic meatus. Now that term meatus can also be called canal. If you like to use that, that's probably a more common one that most people think. Um, this external acoustic meatus or canal is going to end in what common people say is the eardrum, but you're not common anymore. So it is called the tympanic membrane. Now the tympanic membrane, as it vibrates back and forth, there are three bones, very small bones behind it, smallest bones in the body, that as a group are called ossicles. They are in order malleus, incus, stapes. MIS. You can kind of remember that. Malleus, incus, stapes. Now, as this stapes gets pushed, because it's going to take that pressure wave that's hitting the tympanic membrane and move its way through there, and it's going to cause a pressure wave inside of this structure here. Now, it is going to go into, and I'll use stick with yellow, into this structure. This is called the cochlea. The cochlea is where our sense of hearing is. This is where the mechanoreceptors are going to be located to help that. On the other side, I have these incomplete canals called semicircular canals. They are for our sense of balance. Now, all of this information is being poured into a nerve called the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. And remember, you need to know Roman numerals, so it's V111. All right, cranial nerve 8, sensory only. The last thing is this little area, and I'll use this green to kind of shade it in. This little area is a cavity that is pressurized. I need to always try to keep this cavity with the same pressure outside. And the way I do it is through a little tube called the auditory tube. It connects your throat, which in science is called the pharynx, and it's generally closed. And again, this could also be called the eustachian tube if you've heard it that way. It's generally closed, but it's soft tissue. So if, for instance, I get in my car and I'm at sea level here and I drive up into the mountains, I'm going to have this pressure in my head. It's the same as if I drive down the mountains to sea level, but there's a different aspect of it. I'm not going to get into it. But all I need to do is get this canal to burp, basically, to open up, and it will equalize the pressure. So that's why you choose or yawn or, whatever. But do not, under any circumstances, unless you are diving, and I mean going from the surface, diving into water down deep, ever hold your nose and blow. It can be a really bad problem. But anyway, those are the parts of the ear. Pretty straightforward. Again, just to go over them, just real quick. Again, poop, 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 poop. Erase all my chicken scratch. All right, just to give a quick going over, the auricle leads to the external acoustic meatus or canal. That ends in a little membrane called the tympanic membrane. It is going to pass those vibrations through three bones. In order, they are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The stapes, since we're talking about hearing here, is going to be associated with this snail shell looking thing called the cochlea. That is where our mechanoreceptors for sense of hearing are located. On the other side of it, I have these things called semicircular canals. This is going to be for my balance and equilibrium. They have mechanoreceptors in there as well. All of the information is being fed into this thing called the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, which is sensory only. And this cavity that all of this stuff is in is pressurized, and I have a pressure valve called the auditory tube that connects to the pharynx, or commonly called the throat, to help keep that in check. All right. Now these are pictures of the parts of the model. Most of the things are on this little section here. You can see the vestibulocochlear nerve, the cochlea, the stapes, and the semicircular canals on there. This is our picture of the tympanic membrane with the malleus here and the incus off of it, but I'm not going to ask you the malleus and incus on this part. And then we get to the eye, and most people really stress about the eye. Now I'm going to use this picture. There are certain structures that are easier to see on the model, and after I go over everything, I will try to use those to point them out. But I want to remind you, so the eye is all about taking light and turning it into vision. And so I need to first let light in. I need to then regulate how much light is in, because too much is bad, not enough is bad. And then I need to focus the light. I need to bend the light rays in order to produce an image. Now, the eye has three layers. I'm going to go in orders. The outermost layer is called the sclera. It is the thick white outer coat. Now, if the whole eye was the sclera, it wouldn't work out well with our vision. So I have to have a clear portion of it, and that is called the cornea. The cornea is this clear outer portion of the eye. That's the only outer layer. The sclera and its clear window called the cornea. Now, all the cornea is a window. So now I've let light in, so now I need to start regulating the light and focusing. Now that goes into our second layer. Our second layer is called, I don't like that one. That purple didn't work, didn't seem like that was good. So let's say I'll use green. The second layer is called the choroid coat. This is going to be the vascular layer, the blood vessels. On the model, when you're looking at it, this is the middle. You take the sclera off, the one layer, and then you've got this brown part where you can see the blood vessels in it. That's the choroid coat. Now, the choroid coat is going to have several different things in it. All right. Now, the very first thing is I've got a round muscle called the iris. This is the colored part of the eye. It is a smooth muscle, and it has a hollow opening called the pupil in the middle of it. The pupil is literally a name for nothing. It's the window. So I've got the cornea letting light in, and then right behind it I have this round muscle with a hollow opening in the middle of it, the iris and its pupil. And so if I'm in a dark room, the iris is going to contract, is going to dilate back, causing the pupil to get large, letting more light in. If I'm in a very bright room, the iris is going to constrict the pupil and cause it to get smaller to limit the light. Now, right behind that is another thing called the lens. And the lens is just what it says. It is a lens. It is a type of clear tissue. It's a lot of water in it, and it's going to need to change shape because its job is to take this light that is coming in, and so as this light is coming in, it's going to bend it, and as it bends it, it produces an image on the back wall. All right, that's a terrible, there's something wrong with my mouse. I need to clean the bottom part probably. But anyway, so this lens is a pretty important thing. Now the lens has to change shape. It changes shape by a muscle that is around that little area called the ciliary body. I'm going to show you a picture on the model that shows the ciliary body a little better. But it's this little part here. It's this muscle. Right? When it pulls, it is connected to the lens by way of suspensory ligaments. So when it pulls, it and the suspensory ligaments are going to pull back this way, and it's going to cause the lens to get thinner because it's going to put tension on it. That bends light less, and so that's for far sight. If I want to look up close, the ciliary body, the muscle, relaxes a little bit, and now the lens is going to not be pulled as tight, and so we have this bulging out. It's going to expand out, and that's going to cause more angle. That's when we use to look at things close up. Now again, right now and here, all I want you to know is this little structure right here, as far as this goes, this little structure right here is the lens. This is the muscle called the ciliary body and its suspensory ligaments. All right. Now, the innermost layer is going to be a layer that we call the retina. This is the nervous system. The retina is this little yellow, on this picture, this little yellow wallpaper all through here, right? Lining the inside of this, which we're going to learn in just a second, called the posterior cavity. So before we get to the posterior cavity, we look at the fact that this is the optic nerve, all right? This whole area is the optic nerve. Optic nerve is cranial nerve 2. Gosh almighty. cranial nerve 2, almost better using the, the little mouse pad instead, or the little mouse pad on the laptop instead of the actual mouse. Anyway, optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, sensory only. Now, one thing is, as this nerve comes in, this is the only nerve that has this little hollow opening. This is where blood vessels are going to come and go into this posterior cavity. Well, what the optic nerve does is once it enters here, this little thing called the optic disc is where at that point it's going to spread out. The optic nerve turns into basically wallpaper. 360 degrees, it layers the inside of this room. That internal layer is called the retina. Now, the retina has specialized cells called photoreceptors, and they're of two types. I've got rods and I've got cones. Rods are for low light image, so when it's dark, they don't require a lot of light energy, but they produce a black and white picture. Man, I should just quit this. Black and white picture that's grainy. The cones, on the other hand, they need a lot more light energy, but the picture that they produce is in color and it is sharp. And so all along this inner lining, I have rods and cones all studded throughout it, except for this little part here. It is called the fovea centralis. Fovea means small indentation. We looked at this when we were looking at the femur, the fovea capitis, small indentation on the head. This is called fovea centralis. It is the small little divot in the center of our view, because whatever light is coming straight in through here is going to hit this, right, directly on that. But it's a very small field of view. The fovea centralis is entirely made up of cones. And I should learn my lesson, but I don't. Entirely made up of cones. These cones, again, this is making sure that my body has got the sharpest, most color picture directly in front of me. And again, it is a small part of our field of view. The optic disc is going to be our blind spot. You might have heard of that. Now, the last little part of this is going to be that there is a dividing line right along where the lens is. Everything to the back is called the posterior cavity. So the posterior cavity, let's see a better picture here, posterior cavity. The posterior cavity is filled with a very thick fluid called vitreous humor. Humor is the name for body fluid. Vitreous means thick. So this vitreous humor is thick fluid that is found in the posterior cavity. The anterior cavity, everything from the lens forward, is filled with a very watery solution called aqueous humor, which literally means water-like body fluid. All right, so we've gone over the review on this. I had to do it relatively quick. We're still at an hour and 30 minutes on this. Again, I hope this makes sense. I'm going to try to use for my in-person class, the pictures that I'm using, the drawings and the things from books, these will be in the envelope. The models will be on there as well. But I've used the drawing in most places that you can see. Oh, actually, I'm going to point out one other thing with the eye using the model. This picture right here is a good place to see this. All of, and I'll use white, all of this, well, white doesn't show up either. I will use yellow. All of this in here, that represents the ciliary body. That represents the muscle. The part that's kind of rubbed off white here, that represents the suspensory ligaments. And that's one of the easy, this is an easy way to see it instead of just the cross section. Right? Now going back to what I was saying, if you're taking it online, I'm trying to use the pictures that I have, but again, they have a departmental online practical that they want all of us to use, and I've got to try to modify it as best I can for us. But this is the review of the information. You should be able to, again, I hope you know it. I'm not someone that wants to teach on one model and switch it up, but in the grand scheme of things, if you understand the things you're looking at, even if it's on a different model or presented in a different way, you should be able to tell it. Now, again, I'm not trying to do that, but I'm just letting you know if you're taking it online, some of these pictures might not be the same, but it's still the same structures. Um, but I hope this helps. I really do. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.